It was February 1945 in the dense, humid jungles of Luzon, Philippines, a world drowned in mist, sweat, and the echo of war. The air reeked of mud and gunpowder, and somewhere beyond the dripping vines, an army was waiting, silent, unseen, and merciless. 120 American Rangers crouched low among the jungle roots, their faces streaked with mud, their rifles slick with sweat. They weren't lost. They weren't retreating. They were waiting for the Japanese to come. Hours earlier, a scout had returned breathless. The enemy was on the move. 1,000 Japanese soldiers were closing in from every side, a steel ring tightening in the shadows. The Rangers had a choice: fall back and vanish into the trees, or hold their ground and turn the jungle into a killing field. He chose the second. When the first crack of a rifle shattered the night, it wasn't chaos, it was a signal. Every ranger had prepared his sector, every trap was set, every line of fire intersected like clockwork. The Japanese thought they were hunters, but by the time dawn bled across the horizon, the hunters had become the hunted. For 30 minutes, thunder rolled through the trees, gunfire, grenades, shouts, and smoke. When it was over, the jungle fell silent again, except for the whispers of history. Outnumbered nearly 10 to 1, the Rangers stood among the fallen. 500 Japanese soldiers lay dead. The rest had fled into the mist. They knew it was coming. Long before the first Japanese patrol crept through the tangle of vines, long before the jungle night trembled with the whispers of movement, the Rangers could feel it. That silent pulse of danger that every soldier recognizes when the world around him begins to close in. The humidity hung heavy. Pressing against their lungs, each man could taste the metallic bite of anticipation on his tongue. Somewhere beyond the curtain of ferns, 1,000 enemy soldiers were preparing to tighten their ring, but the 120 men of the 6th Ranger Battalion weren't caught by surprise. No, they were the ones who had drawn the circle. Days earlier, they had chosen this patch of jungle not because it offered safety, but because it offered control. Terrain sloped slightly downward into a basin surrounded by thick trees and tangled roots. A natural bowl that the Japanese believed would trap any smaller force foolish enough to stand there. To the Rangers, it was the perfect stage for their trap. Every root, every fallen branch, every hollow log was catalogued and remembered. They had turned the land itself into a weapon. The men worked in silence, speaking only in low murmurs. They cut narrow fire lanes through the foliage, just wide enough for a single rifle barrel or machine gun muzzle. They covered them again with vines and leaves, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Heavy weapons were positioned along the inner ridges. Browning Multi-19 machine guns, their barrels oiled and ready. Tripwires were laid out in spiderweb patterns, connecting to grenades hidden under the leaves. In the sweltering dark, sweat dripped into their eyes, but they kept working. Every cut, every movement was part of the plan. These men weren't ordinary infantry. They were Rangers, disciplined, ruthless, and trained to fight behind enemy lines. They had learned the art of turning chaos into precision. Their commander, a man whose calm voice could cut through the roar of battle, had told them plainly, "We will not run, we will let them come." And so they prepared not to escape, but to entrap. They dug shallow fighting holes, reinforced with bamboo and dirt, perfectly concealed. When they finally crouched behind their weapons, it wasn't with fear, but with grim readiness. The jungle became a living organism around them, steaming, breathing, dripping. Every sound carried meaning. The hum of insects, the distant croak of a frog, the whisper of a leaf falling. Somewhere a branch snapped, and every ranger's finger tightened on his trigger. They knew that the Japanese, with their sense of confidence and numerical superiority, believed they were the predators here. The Japanese troops had spent years mastering infiltration, ambush, and night attacks. But the Rangers had studied them. They knew the enemy's rhythm, their arrogance, their tendency to encircle and crush isolated forces. And so the Rangers had chosen to let them do exactly that. But this time, the circle was made of steel and willpower. By dusk, the forest dimmed into shades of grey. The smell of rain floated through the air. A few Rangers silently ate from their cold rations, their eyes never leaving the darkness. Others checked ammunition, loading belts and magazines with slow, practiced motion. One man quietly tied a strip of cloth around his wrist, a habit before every battle, so his comrades could identify him if he fell. They all knew what they were facing. 120 against 1,000. Those numbers don't lie, but numbers alone never told the story of war. They waited as the jungle grew quiet again. The moon struggled to break through the cloud cover, and every movement sent small shadows crawling across the forest floor. Somewhere far away, the Japanese advance units were cutting through vines and bamboo, whispering to one another in short, clipped tones. The Rangers could almost feel their presence now, the sound of boots on soft earth, the clinking of metal, the rustle of equipment. The encirclement had begun. It was exactly what the Americans wanted. In their foxholes, the Rangers could sense the tightening noose. The Japanese were spreading out in wide arcs, forming that familiar crescent shape that would soon collapse inward. A perfect encirclement, a perfect illusion of control. What they didn't realize was that every approach they used had already been mapped, measured, and crossfired. If they took one step too far, they'd enter a killing lane. If they hesitated, a machine gun would find them. The Rangers' discipline was their armor. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They let the enemy come. Hours passed. Sweat stung their eyes, mosquitoes bit their necks, and their fingers cramped on cold triggers. Still no one fired. In that silence, the forest itself seemed to hold its breath. Finally, the first faint sound of Japanese whispers drifted through the undergrowth. Then came another, a metallic clink of a rifle sling, the crunch of a boot. Through the slits in their camouflage, the Rangers could see them now, dark silhouettes moving between the trees, their helmets glinting faintly in the moonlight. They were close, maybe 50 yards away, spreading out in groups. Still, the Americans waited. The Japanese commander gave a signal, barely audible, a soft bird call. The encirclement was nearly complete. Soon they would close the trap, believing they had pinned down a desperate, broken American patrol. In their minds, this would be another easy victory, another night of annihilation in the Pacific. They couldn't see the calm, waiting eyes that watched them through the leaves. They couldn't feel the invisible crosshairs converging on their every move. The Rangers' commander lifted his hands slowly. No one moved except the men watching him. His gesture was simple. Not yet. He wanted the entire enemy force inside. He wanted them confident, fearless, walking right into the center where the Rangers' fire would overlap in a perfect storm. Every man in the unit understood what that meant. It took nerves of steel not to fire. It took patience measured in heartbeats. The Japanese patrols grew bolder. Some began creeping closer, rifles raised. They were whispering to each other now, pointing toward the shadows where they believed the Americans were hiding. One soldier crouched low, stepping over a log, and triggered the first tripwire. A faint click, then silence. The explosion that followed shattered the stillness. A blinding flash lit up the jungle, followed by a concussive roar that sent leaves and dirt flying. A Japanese squad vanished in an instant. The Rangers didn't fire. Not yet. They listened to the confusion, the shouts, the barking orders. Then came more movement. The Japanese began rushing in, thinking they had sprung a defensive trap, unaware that the true ambush was still waiting. Every Ranger's pulse quickened. The commander raised his hand again and slowly, deliberately lowered it. The jungle erupted. From a dozen positions, machine guns roared to life, their muzzle flashes turning the night into chaos. Tracer rounds cut through the mist like red-hot needles, tearing through branches and bodies alike. The Japanese, caught in the open, dove for cover that didn't exist. Bullets shredded through vines and tree trunks. The ground shook with the impact of grenades. Within seconds, what had been an organized encirclement dissolved into chaos. The Rangers worked in pairs, one firing while the other reloaded, their movements synchronized through months of training. They didn't waste ammunition. Every burst was controlled, every shot aimed. Communication was near silent. A tap on the shoulder, a nod, a short signal. They didn't need to talk. The battlefield itself spoke for them. Some Japanese soldiers tried to regroup, shouting orders through the chaos. But the Americans had calculated every escape route. Machine gun fire stitched across the paths, cutting down anyone who moved. Those who survived stumbled deeper into the trap, only to find themselves face to face with another Ranger squad lying in wait. The battle raged for less than an hour, but in that time the jungle became a living nightmare. Smoke filled the air, thick and choking. Smell of burning powder mixed with the damp scent of earth. Trees were splintered, their bark shredded by bullets. In the flashes of gunfire, faces appeared, contorted, desperate, fighting to survive. And yet, through it all, the Rangers moved with mechanical precision. They had trained for this: small unit tactics, jungle warfare, ambushes. Their world had narrowed to the space of their sights, the weight of their weapon, the rhythm of their breathing. Fear didn't control them, it fueled them. When the first rays of dawn began filtering through the treetops, the gunfire slowed. The Japanese had withdrawn, their dead scattered across the ground. The Rangers stayed still for several more minutes, listening for movement. None came. Jungle was silent again, save for the occasional drip of rain from the leaves. Then slowly, the men began to rise. They checked their weapons, replaced barrels, bandaged wounds. Some stared at the bodies lying motionless in the mud. There was no celebration, no shouting, just exhaustion and relief. They had survived what should have been impossible. They had invited 1,000 men to surround them, and they had lived to tell about it. Because they had planned every step, trusted every brother beside them, and turned nature itself into an ally. In the end, it wasn't superior numbers that won. It was intellect. It was patience. It was courage under the crushing weight of fear. The 6th Ranger Battalion had transformed an ambush into annihilation, and the jungle would remember their names long after they had vanished into its shadow. The jungle was still black when it began, that hour before dawn when shadows blur and the air feels too heavy to breathe. The Rangers had been awake all night listening to the rhythm of the forest. They could hear it change little by little, the rustle of the wind replaced by something more deliberate. Movement, the sound of men, the encirclement was closed. Somewhere out in that darkness, hundreds of Japanese soldiers were threading their way through the trees, whispering to each other in clipped voices, tightening the ring one silent step at a time. Inside that ring, 120 American Rangers crouched low, rifles steady, nerves drawn like wire. Every muscle was tense, but no one moved. They could feel the pressure, the invisible weight of an approaching storm. The jungle was alive with energy, every leaf trembling as if anticipating the first strike. The plan was simplicity. In war is deceptive. They would wait. They would let the enemy come close, so close they could see the whites of their eyes if dawn arrived early. Then when the trap was complete, they would strike with every weapon they had. It wasn't about holding the line, it was about destroying it entirely. At exactly 430, a flare of orange light sliced through the night sky, not from the Rangers, but from the enemy. It was a signal barely visible above the trees. Then came the sound, faint at first, then swelling, hundreds of voices rising together in a fierce, echoing shout. The Japanese charge had begun. They came in waves, their silhouettes flickering through the mist, bayonets glinting in the faint starlight, the air filled with the pounding of boots, the clatter of metal, and the guttural roar of battle cries meant to break the will of any defender. But the Rangers did not move. They watched. They waited until the circle was fully formed, until the enemy was within 50 yards on every side. Then their commander whispered one word into the darkness. Now, the jungle exploded. Machine guns roared from hidden nests, cutting through the mist in long, controlled bursts. Tracer rounds stitched red arcs across the darkness, slicing through trees, leaves, and flesh alike. The Japanese front ranks staggered, torn apart before they could even react. The roar of the 1919s was deafening, echoing off the trees like thunder trapped in a bottle. Grenades flew through the air, tumbling end over end before bursting into showers of fire and dirt. The first wave crumpled, but the second kept coming. Dozens of figures crashed through the undergrowth, shouting and firing wildly into the shadows. Their bullets tore through branches, ripping chunks of bark from trees, but most hit nothing. The Rangers had disappeared into the terrain, invisible behind their camouflage, their positions so well hidden that even muzzle flashes were swallowed by the dark. The commander moved between positions, crouched low, his voice calm and steady. A short bursts, aim low, keep it tight. His words cut through the chaos like a blade. Around him, the men obeyed without hesitation. They fired in rotation, one squad unleashing a wall of bullets while another reloaded, maintaining constant pressure without wasting a single round. Every movement was rehearsed, disciplined, precise. Then came the grenade. From both flanks, the Rangers lobbed fragmentation grenades into the advancing enemy ranks. The explosions were brutal, tearing the jungle apart in bright flashes that lit up faces twisted in shock. Shrapnel shredded through the air, and the screams that followed merged with the roar of gunfire into one horrific symphony. The smell of burnt powder, blood, and wet soil filled the air. The Japanese assault wavered momentarily. But then more shadows emerged, pushing forward through smoke and debris. They were fearless, some charging directly into machine gun fire, others diving behind fallen logs and returning fire with rifles and submachine guns. The Rangers responded with cold efficiency. They had no time to think of mercy. Every second of hesitation meant death. One Ranger squad, positioned along a narrow ridge, was hit by concentrated fire from the right flank. Bullets sliced through leaves inches above their heads. Without orders, one of the men, a sergeant with a streak of mud across his cheek, rolled from cover and fired a burst from his Thompson. 3 enemy soldiers dropped instantly. His squad followed, pouring fire into the breach until the jungle fell quiet again. The sergeant ducked back into position, reloading calmly as shells clinked against the dirt. All around the perimeter, similar scenes unfolded. Chaos met with composure. The Rangers were fighting as one organism, every squad covering another, every position interlocked. What looked like madness from the outside was actually a machine of survival built on discipline and instinct. The Japanese commander, furious and desperate, signaled for a flanking maneuver. His men began to swing around to the left, trying to find a weak point. But the Rangers had anticipated that move hours earlier. They let them come closer, then detonated 2 claymore mines buried in the soil. The blast was catastrophic. Flames and shrapnel erupted in a fan-shaped burst, cutting down dozens instantly. The survivors stumbled backward, screaming as another machine gun nest opened fire. The enemy's circle had become their grave. Minutes turned into an eternity. The noise was overwhelming. The crack of rifles, the dull thud of explosions, the shrill whine of ricochets, and beneath it all the sound of shouting, orders, screams, cries for help. The air was so thick with smoke visibility dropped to a few meters. Men fought by instinct, firing at flashes and movement, reloading by touch. At one point, a group of Japanese soldiers broke through the outer perimeter and rushed a foxhole. 2 Rangers were there, one firing his bar until the barrel glowed red, the other tossing grenades overhand like a baseball. The last attacker lunged forward, bayonet aimed, but the Ranger met him with a rifle butt to the face. The struggle lasted seconds, then ended in silence. When it was over, both Rangers were breathing hard, hands shaking, but they were alive. Elsewhere, another machine gun jammed. The gunner cursed under his breath, working frantically to clear the jam as rounds snapped through the air above him. His assistant leaned in, feeding new belts, while a third man fired single shots from a Garand to keep the enemy at bay. Sweat and rain mixed on their faces, running down in muddy streaks. Finally, the gun roared back to life, spitting fury once again. For every Japanese charge, there was an American counter-volley. For every step forward, the enemy paid in blood. The jungle floor turned slick and red. Still they came, hundreds more, driven by command or desperation. They screamed a banzai and surged forward, but the Rangers stood firm. The Americans had been trained for this kind of assault. They let the enemy come close, then opened fire at point-blank range, turning every charge into a slaughter. The battle was reaching its breaking point. Smoke rolled low across the ground. The dawn light began to creep through the treetops, casting the first pale rays of morning over the carnage. The Rangers were running low on ammunition, but their fire never wavered. The commander moved among them, shouting over the noise, distributing extra belts and magazines. His uniform was soaked, his face streaked with mud, but his voice never broke. The Japanese commander could see it now. His men scattered, morale collapsing, bodies littering the ground. What was meant to be a swift annihilation had turned into a nightmare. He ordered a withdrawal, but it was too late. His communications had been shattered. The jungle itself seemed to rebel, the air thick with smoke and death. He watched helplessly as another squad disappeared under a hail of gunfire. When the final burst of gunfire faded, it was replaced by silence. Deep, heavy, almost sacred. The kind of silence that only comes after unimaginable violence. The Rangers remained in position, scanning the tree line for movement. Slowly, they realized the enemy had broken. The remaining Japanese were fleeing, melting back into the jungle they had once believed was theirs. The Rangers didn't cheer. They didn't speak. They just breathed, ragged, exhausted, grateful. They had survived 30 minutes of hell. The aftermath was a vision of destruction. The once lush forest was now torn apart. Trees splintered, smoke drifting through gaps where branches had been blown away. The ground was cratered and soaked, the smell of burnt gunpowder clinging to the air. Bodies lay in twisted shapes among the roots, rifles still clutched in lifeless hands. The rangers began to move, clearing weapons, checking for wounded. Some leaned against trees, too tired to speak. Methodically reloaded, hands still trembling. They were alive, and that was enough. For the Japanese, it was a disaster beyond comprehension. Out of 1,000 men, nearly half would never rise again. The rest scattered, broken, leaving behind a field of silence. For the 6th Ranger Battalion, it was victory born from madness. Not because they wanted the fight, but because they had mastered the art of control amid chaos. Their discipline had held against overwhelming odds. Their patience had turned a trap into triumph. In those 30 minutes, the line between hunter and hunted had vanished. And when the smoke cleared, only one truth remained. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the will to act despite it. The battle ended the way thunder fades after a storm. Not with a sudden stop, but with a slow unraveling into silence. The last burst of gunfire echoed through the trees and vanished into the mist. Then came only the rain. Soft, hesitant at first, then steady. It fell over the jungle like a sigh, cooling the earth still trembling from explosions. The rangers didn't cheer. They didn't move. They just listened to the patter of rain on leaves, to the hiss of steam rising from hot barrels, to the strange stillness that always follows death. The smoke lingered like ghosts. Every gust of wind revealed fragments of what had been, the blackened stumps of trees, torn roots jutting from the ground, the metallic glint of shell casings scattered like confetti of destruction. The jungle that had once been vibrant green was now scarred in shades of grey and red. Yet beneath all that ruin, life still hummed. Insects crawled from cracks, raindrops gathered on leaves. The distant cry of a bird trembled through the wet air, as if the forest itself was reclaiming what man had tried to destroy. The rangers moved carefully through what was left of the battlefield. Boots squelched in mud thick with rain and blood. Every step carried the weight of survival, the disbelief that they were still standing, still breathing, still here. Some moved wordlessly, checking the fallen for signs of life, others collecting weapons and ammunition from the ground. There were no words between them. Words would have felt too fragile in that place. A sergeant knelt beside a body, Japanese, no older than 20. His helmet was gone, his rifle half buried in the dirt. The sergeant stared for a long moment, then reached out and gently closed the man's eyes. In that act, there was no hatred, only the quiet understanding shared by soldiers on opposite sides of the same human tragedy. Around him, others did the same. They weren't celebrating a victory. They were acknowledging a cost. The commander walked the perimeter, his boots sinking deep into the softened ground. He paused at every position, speaking softly to each man, his voice calm but heavy. "You did well," he said to one. "Hold tight," to another. He checked the wounded first. A man with a shrapnel wound in the arm. Another who had been grazed across the leg. The medics worked quickly, wrapping bandages, injecting morphine, whispering reassurances that felt too small for the moment. Rainwater pooled in the shell craters, mixing with the dark stains of battle until the earth itself looked wounded. The rangers gathered their gear, securing what ammunition remained. Their faces were unreadable. Exhaustion, relief, grief, all tangled together. They had won, yes, but no one truly wins in a place like this. As dawn rose higher, the mist began to lift. Shafts of pale gold sunlight pierced through the canopy, painting the broken landscape in eerie beauty. Steam rose from the warm ground as if the forest was breathing again. The air smelled of wet leaves and smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a single rifle cracked, not a shot of battle, but a mercy kill for a wounded enemy who had whispered his last prayer in Japanese. The commander gave the order to move out. The rangers formed up, carrying their wounded on improvised stretchers made from branches and canvas. They moved silently, their eyes scanning the jungle even now, wary of what might still lurk beyond sight. Every sound, a snapping twig, a falling leaf, made hearts tense for a fraction of a second. War teaches a man never to trust silence for long. As they walked, the forest began to swallow their footsteps. The trail behind them disappeared almost instantly as vines and leaves fell back into place. It was as if the jungle itself wanted to erase the memory of what had just occurred. But memories don't fade so easily. They cling to the mind, the flash of an explosion, the scream that cuts through rain, the sight of a comrade's hand going still. These things don't leave. They simply grow quieter over time. One ranger, his hands still trembling, stopped for a moment and looked back at the clearing. The smoke was still rising in thin white ribbons, curling upward like prayers to the indifferent sky. He didn't know why he looked back. Maybe to make sure it was real, maybe to promise himself he'd remember. Then he turned and followed the others into the trees. For 30 minutes of combat, they had faced 1,000 men and survived. But survival comes with its own weight. They had witnessed the raw essence of war. Not glory, not honor, but the stripped, brutal simplicity of kill or be killed. In that clarity, something inside every man had changed. The boy who had stepped into the jungle that night was not the same man who was now walking out of it. Hours later, they reached a small rise overlooking a river that cut through the jungle like a ribbon of silver. Here the air was clearer. They stopped to rest. The commander knelt beside the water and washed his hands, watching as the red swirls faded downstream. He didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he said quietly, "This is why we fight smart, because fighting brave isn't always enough." The men nodded. They understood. The battle they had just fought would not appear in grand headlines or victory parades. It would be a footnote, one small engagement in a vast, endless war. But for the men who lived it, it would never be forgotten. They ate in silence, cold rations mixed with the taste of rain. Some stared at nothing, replaying moments they couldn't yet process. Others began to clean their weapons, mechanical motions that offered a kind of stability amid the chaos in their minds. Every now and then one of them would glance toward the jungle behind them, as if expecting the ghosts of their fallen enemies to emerge. As the day wore on, the rain stopped. The clouds parted, revealing a sky washed clean and impossibly blue. The birds returned timid at first, then louder. Nature resumed its endless rhythm, uncaring of human conflict. And in that strange peace, the rangers began to feel the fatigue they had been holding back. One by one, some dozed off against their packs, rifles still across their chests. By evening, the sun burned low, bleeding orange light across the treetops. The commander gathered his men and spoke softly. "We did what we came to do. Now we move." There was no speech, no attempt at inspiration, just a quiet acknowledgement of endurance. They rose, shouldered their gear, and disappeared once again into the jungle, ghosts among ghosts. Behind them lay the battlefield, now silent, except for the steady chorus of insects. The smoke had thinned. The bodies would soon be claimed by the earth. Within days, vines would crawl over the fallen, leaves would bury shell casings, and the forest would look almost untouched. Only the soil would remember. In the months that followed, stories of that battle spread among soldiers. They called it many things, the stand of the 120, other jungle ring, other 30-minute war. But the truth of it was simpler. It was the story of men who refused to run, who used cunning instead of panic, and who turned an ambush into annihilation. When asked later how they managed it, one ranger said only, "We just didn't want to die running." That sentence became the quiet epitaph for those who fought there, a testament not to heroism, but to will. Years later, long after the war had ended, one of the surviving rangers returned to Luzon. The jungle had grown thick again, lush and green, erasing almost every trace of what had happened. He stood where his foxhole had once been and listened to the hum of insects, the whisper of wind through leaves. The air was heavy with the scent of life, not death. He smiled faintly and said to no one in particular, "We gave it back to you." Then he turned and walked away. Time had done what it always does. It softened the edges, blurred the details, transformed horror into history. But the essence of that moment, the courage born from fear, the unity forged under fire, the silence after the storm, remained carved in memory. For 30 minutes in that jungle, humanity had been stripped bare. And in that nakedness, those rangers had discovered something eternal. That survival is not just about strength or skill, but about faith. Faith in your brothers, faith in the plan, and faith that even in the darkest moments, you can stand your ground and face the storm. When the last light of day slipped away, the jungle once again belonged to itself. The frogs croaked, the birds called, and the leaves rustled in a rhythm older than war. The world had moved on. But somewhere in the soil of Luzon, beneath the roots and the rain, the echoes of that battle still slept, waiting for anyone who cared to listen.